Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Ripe again. And in today's video, an HOA president named Karen tried to evict me from my 150-year-old property and even attempted to put a lien on it despite the fact that I was never part of the HOA. Here's exactly what went down. So let's jump straight into the story. The house I live in has stood for over 150 years now, and for those of you who enjoy history, you'll recognize that this dates back to just after the Civil War, my great-great-great-grandfather. And honestly, I'm never completely sure how many greats are in there, but I did go back and check the records. Built it himself with his own hands after the war, had completely flattened everything that once stood on his land. People came from all around trying to buy it, offering him money because the surrounding land had been cheapened after being soaked in blood, but he turned every single one of them down and instead brought his family back the moment the house was standing again. Over the past century and a half, the home has seen its fair share of additions and renovations. Plumbing and electricity were eventually added, weaving their way through the structure. But despite all those changes, the heart of the home was always preserved. It was passed down through generation after generation until eventually it came into my father's hands. I was only the second man in my family to be born in a hospital, the first being my older brother. But that didn't mean we were any less shaped by that house. And that land, unfortunately, my brother was lost during Vietnam. So I ended up becoming the first man in my family to graduate from college. My father was an incredibly strong man in many ways. Even though he was an only child, he never gave his parents any reason to wish they had more children. He worked the farm nearly every day from the time he could walk, and somehow still managed to court a wonderful woman and bring her back to the farm to build a life together. He could be strict and firm, but you would struggle to find a better role model anywhere. Me and my siblings were raised working that same land, but he never allowed the farm to get in the way of our education the way it had for him. Honestly, I think that's why he kept having children until my mother finally put her foot down. But the moment we graduated high school, he refused to let us do any real farm work until we had college degrees. He was proud of us, and we were just as proud of him. After graduating, I got a job in a nearby city and lived in apartments over the years. But no matter where I went, that farm was always home eventually, though even his pride couldn't keep him going forever. And he had to step away from the farm. It hadn't been profitable for nearly a decade, especially with the city expanding closer and closer. Seeing him lying still was something none of us were used to, and as hard as it was, many of us felt a strange sense of relief when he passed, believing he'd gone somewhere he could keep working as hard as he always had. As the oldest living son, the farm passed down to me, and I think by now it's clear that this place is more than just land to us. It's part of our blood, our history, our identity. So when I had the chance to move my own family out there, even if it meant adding an extra 30 minutes to my commute, I didn't hesitate for a second. It's also worth mentioning that the city grew long after my home had already claimed its place on that land by the time I inherited it. The area around me was being turned into a suburban escape from the city, something like a satellite town. Developers kept coming with offers to try by the land, and I made a bit of a game out of turning them down. We even kept a sort of display board filled with copies of all the offers and contracts people had brought to us. My lawyer said it was smart to keep the documents, so I figured why not turn it into something fun. I never cared much for hunting, but I imagine felt similar to mounting a trophy on the wall. And the best part was knowing I'd pass that same mindset down to my children. Anyone who tried to cheat them in the future would have a long fight ahead. By the time everything was developed, the only letters I still received aside from real estate offers were from the HOA asking me to join their association and place my land under their so-called protection. As if my land needed protection from a group of overly comfortable middle-aged couples, I always responded the same way, firmly refusing and keeping copies of every letter they sent. Eventually, their messages slowed down until they were almost non-existent, and that's why when a certain envelope arrived, it stood out immediately. What made it even more unusual was the content. Inside, it was a warning about an eventual eviction process that would begin if I didn't make payments, leading toward a lien being placed on my property by the HOA. I read the document carefully and saw that they were claiming to hold a lien on my 150-year-old home for 5 years of unpaid fees. And dues, the first thing I had to do was calm myself down. So I didn't go out and strangle the first person I saw. The second thing was call my lawyer and schedule a meeting. And the third was to go find out if whoever sent this letter had recently escaped from a padded room. I drove through what felt like a white suburban purgatory full of identical houses and quiet bureaucracy until I ended up sitting across from Karen, the proud president of the HOA that governed the neighboring development, and apparently in her mind my property as well. Her office was set up just off her immaculate foyer inside a perfectly designed cookie-cutter home with heavy makeup, a stiff perm, and enough hairspray to make her look as artificial as the perfectly trimmed lawn outside. I placed a letter on her desk and simply asked if she could explain it. She barely glanced at it, and I could already see the smug expression. She knew exactly what she had done. She said it was just a proper legal process, and that there are consequences for ignoring civil responsibilities. I told her I was fully aware of that, but what I didn't understand was when exactly my property had become part of her HOA, considering I had never signed anything. She responded with a tight expression, offering condolences to my father, and claiming that before he passed, he had agreed to join her HOA to ensure the land was properly cared for. I leaned forward, placing my hand firmly on the letter, and told her my father ensured that land was cared for by leaving it to me, and that no one in my family would ever sign away ownership to anyone. I kept myself from saying anything harsher, even though I knew very well what my father's opinion of HOAs had been. I asked her for a copy of the contract, and after she initially refused, I made it clear I wasn't leaving until I got it. Eventually, we reached a compromise, and I have to admit the signature looked convincing. But I knew my father far better than they ever could, and I also knew exactly where he was on the day he supposedly signed it. So I contacted my lawyer immediately. I needed to make sure I wasn't about to lose a home that had been in my family for 6 generations. Karen wasted no time either and filed a lawsuit almost immediately, claiming I had violated the terms of the contract and even accusing me of assaulting her in her own home. What had started as a distant threat suddenly became very real. She wanted my home, and she wanted it now. Soon enough, my lawyer and I found ourselves in court. Karen had her own attorney funded by HOA dues, and her case ready even if it wasn't particularly strong. And if you're wondering why she ended up in the defendant's seat instead, well, her original lawsuit never even made it to trial. She presented the supposed contract signed by my father along with letters I had sent rejecting their offers, twisting them into proof of mispayments, and then presented notice of the lien claiming it didn't require my consent. I responded by showing that my father had been in surgery on the exact day he supposedly signed the contract, and even if he had somehow been able to sign it, he would have been under anesthesia and not in a proper state of mind. Then we presented my collection of letters proving a consistent history of rejecting every attempt they had made. They backed down quickly and removed the lien, but my lawyer and I weren't satisfied with that being the end of it. We dug deeper into state regulations and found that the volume and nature of the letters they had sent could be considered harassment. On top of that, we had evidence suggesting the contract itself had been forged, and when we followed the money trail, we discovered that HOA dues were being funneled into accounts controlled by Karen that weren't officially tied to the HOA, which meant fraud and embezzlement were also on the table. By the time we brought criminal charges against her, we had built a solid case of harassment, fraud, embezzlement, the works. And I can confidently say she won't be in charge of anything ever again if she even gets out of prison. And honestly, I'm perfectly fine with that. And that's the story. Let's just hope that Karen never gets control over another neighborhood, because she was nothing more than a small-time dictator.